Welcome everyone for a interesting session. What we are going to discuss is exits for private equity and VC investors. Now, this topic, one is so deep, so we can actually go for days, not just hours, right? And we are trying to cover in 60 minutes some of the aspects. So we will try to cover as many aspects as we can, but we may not be able to cover everything, and we may not be able to cover everything in very deep in detail. So you need to bear with us, and if you can take certain things offline if it is required. Also, since there are very many situations and circumstances in which the investments happen, what we have done is we have broadly assumed that the company is Indian company. The founder or promoter is actually based in India, and we have also assumed that most of the investments are coming from outside India. So we will take that into account. That's a basic assumption we have made. However, we also were cognizant of the fact that more and more investments are coming through AIFs in India, and because they're coming through AIF, certain restrictions which are applicable to the foreign investors are not applicable to AIF. So we will also address that situation wherever relevant. Coming now to before I come to the session, I just want to remind everyone that uh, as the session goes, please put on your questions. If questions are there, as early as possible, because if you put it at later part of the session, we may not be able to take it up. With that, I'm starting the session. As an introduction, when you talk about exit waterfalls, right? First, let us understand why we are talking about exit waterfall in first place, right? Why there is an exit in first place? When private equity and VC are just investing, why they are talking about an exit, right? This is one of the unique aspects of private equity and VC. Now, again, uh, it depends on whether this is a strategic investor or it's a financial investor. Most of the private equity and VCs are financial investor, which means they go out, they collect money from LPs, which are different institutions, and they invest in Indian company with a limited timeline uh, by which they need to make an investment, have an exit, and return money to the investors. Because of the timeline which they need to return money to the investor, there is always an exit clause in the investment agreements. Now, the timeline really depends on one, how the fund is structured. Second, what state that particular fund is. Third, what is the round of investment, which means it's an initial round or it is late stage. And also, as I said, whether it's a financial investor or a strategic investor. If it is a strategic investor, they typically do balance sheet investments, and as a result, they don't have the pressure of exiting as a financial investor has. Now, strategic investors are corporate strategic investors, or they are sovereign wealth funds. So typically, you will see different exit scenarios or discussion negotiation based on the kind of investor, as well as at what state that fund is. Um, Generally, what waterfall we see is IPO as a first step. That's kind of having golden standard, saying that look, if you take company public, then you've done your job, and then we can exit whenever we want to exit on a public market. So that's the first option, or that's the first waterfall you will see in. Generally, if somebody has come at the initial level, they give 5 to 6 year period for company to grow and go public. If somebody is coming at a later stage, the number of period or the time period may be little lesser. So again, depending on that. But the first thing is always saying that, hey, can you take company public with anywhere between, let's say, 5 to 6 years. Now, once company has gone company has not gone public. If company goes public, everything falls away, and the agreement comes to an end, or most aspects of agreement comes to an end. Um, if company does not go public, and which is a situation or which is a scenario in most of the exits, then you go into the next waterfall. Now, typically, next waterfall is a situation where the investor says to company that, hey, please facilitate me finding a buyer to buy my shares. Now, generally, investors will can sell their shares independently of the company, or sometimes if the situation is such that they have not been able to find, they may ask a company to find a buyer for them, where company can either offer at a particular fair market value, or at an option which is beyond a certain IRR of the investment which investor has come in. This is typically an option in case investor wants to take it up and sell and exit the company, assuming company or the promoter is able to find a buyer. If that does not happen, then you go into the next waterfall, which is the buyback rights. Now, buyback is basically two kinds of buyback. One is buyback by the company, or it's a put on promoter. Again, this and the earlier one can be interchanged. It's not a strict order which you always see, but this is generally the waterfall which we see. If buyback and or put does not work out, then in which case it goes to the fourth waterfall situation, which is a drag rights. Now, what we see is that if IPO doesn't happen, then within the prescribed framework, which is 5 to 6 years, whatever has been negotiated, then company gets another 6 months, sometimes a year, depending on the negotiating power, to find a buyer. Generally, it is few months. It's not more than 6 months. And if buyer does not come in, or if there are no such transactions which happen, in which case you go to the next one, which is buyback or put option. However, in situation, there have been negotiations where if company or founder is able to find a buyer, and the buyer is willing to pay over a certain price, which has been agreed with the investor, and if investor doesn't exit, then all these rights fall away, right? So those kind of negotiations also happen, and we have seen it in the transactions. We don't see too many exits in this scenario in terms of company or founder finding a buyer. It does happen, but not as a part of the exit rights. It generally happens on an informal basis. Then you look at the buyback and the put option. Buyback and put option have restrictions and may not always be possible to enforce, and we'll look into it detail later in the session. And hence, really speaking, the first three exit waterfalls are generally understood to be on a best effort basis, which means really it is not guaranteed that it can be enforced and you can investor can get an exit, which brings it to the last and the fourth most important exit, which is a drag rights. Now, drag rights typically means that the investor has an ability to drag all the shareholders or some of the shareholders to exit and sell it to strategic buyer who can buy everybody's shares, including the investor shares and promoter shares, and he may be willing to buy it because he then gets control. So basically, drag rights leads to change in control more often than not, right? And that has a lot of issues and discussion, which we will possibly do it over our session. But this is kind of exit waterfall which we see. With this, let me start my question to Prashant. Prashant, as I discussed, IPO is considered to be gold standard. It's the first exit which everybody looks for. Can you tell, is it something which is popular, and what is the typical issues you see in the IPO exits?
Thanks for that question. So, as you mentioned, that it is definitely a gold standard when it comes to P's exiting from their existing investments. And in terms of popularity, of course, it is one of the preferred options, and especially in the context of a growth stage or a late stage company, given that there is a shorter period for them to be able to make a better return on their investments. To give, I mean, like for instance, if I talk of one of the latest IPOs that happened, which happened last month, which of course, I mean, after the IPO happened, the price of the shares may have gone down, but in terms of the return that it got to its exiting investors, I mean, it was not a complete exit, but Carlyle Group was one of the investors who made a partial exit in that case, and they happened to got a return which sort of set a precedent, and then which turned out to be one of the highest returns that the investor would have made out of an IPO exit. Now, with respect to IPOs, I mean, two things which are very important is the valuation at which you are doing it and the timing when you're doing it. Now, with respect to valuation, it is possible that while negotiating the investment agreement, you build in certain protections in there in terms of a qualified IPO. Qualified IPO is where you agree for a valuation beforehand on what price, I mean, you would agree for the IPO to happen, or a certain quantity of shares that may be offered as part of the IPO is what can be agreed upon as part of the qualified IPO mechanism. And when I say timing is important, is I mean, what I mean by that is that there has to be a demand for the shares in the market. And in times like these, where the country is undergoing a pandemic crisis, we have not seen a lot of demand for IPO offerings, and because of which a lot of companies who had in fact filed their offer documents are also contemplating whether to continue with their IPO or not. And in scenarios like that, where say a draft offer document has been filed and a lot of special rights that the investor had has fallen away, or the convertible shares that the convertible securities that they had in the entity have been converted, and if the companies still don't go public, there are certain repercussions of that. Now we'll go through each of these challenges that an investor may follow in detail, and while understanding what are the regulatory requirements for an investor to participate in an IPO, these are some of the issues that they need to keep in mind. And in case there is a failure of IPO, how can they safeguard themselves at the time of entering the investment agreement by putting in certain necessary clauses there. Now, before I move on, it is important to understand that an investor can participate in an IPO in two ways. One, as a promoter investor, or second, as a ordinary investor. Now, when would an investor be qualified as a promoter investor? So there is a definition of promoter under the ICDR regulation that basically include anyone who has been named as a promoter in the offer document, or somebody who is in control of the entity, or somebody who is an advisor to the entity on whose advice the board generally acts, but the advisor must not be advising in his or professional capacity. And there are certain exemptions in the sense that if, say, a AIF or an FPI or an FECI, if they have made investments into a company, just by virtue of, say, holding up to 20% shares, they cannot be qualified as a promoter. And there has to be other criteria that they should meet for them to be qualified as a promoter. And once qualified or identified as promoter, they are expected to they're expected to stand behind the company during the IPO, and sort of also act as a confirming party for all the disclosures that the company would be making in its offer document. Whereas if you are an ordinary investor, and when I say an ordinary investor, it means a non-promoter investor, then your confirmations that you have to give with respect to the disclosures are limited to your participation in the IPO. And when the investors participate in an IPO, it is the offer for sale part of the IPO. So an IPO can happen either by way of fresh issuance of shares or by way of offer for sale. Offer for sale is the part where the shareholders get to exercise their exit option. Now, with respect to promoters, uh, when identified as such, they are also required to maintain a minimum promoter contribution, which generally is around 20% of the post-issue capital of the company, and that contribution would then be subject to a three. Whereas in case of other investors, if say they decide partial exit and not a complete exit, their IPO shareholding in the company would then get locked in for a period of 1 year. Now, with respect to the lock-in, there are certain exemptions with respect to the investors being a VCF or a Category 1 AIF or a Category 2 AIF or a foreign venture capital investor. If you are any of these category of investors, then you are exempted. Subject to the condition that you should have been holding those shares at least for a period of 1 year upon an agreed lock-in. So to give you an example, say if you acquired those shares say 6 months back, and the requirement under law is that the shares would be locked in for a period of 1 year. But in your case, since you have already served that 6 month period, if you and when I say your case, I'm referring to the cases where you are a VCF, AIF 1, 2, or an FVCI, then the lock-in period in that case would be the remaining 6 month period to complete 1 year. And now, when investor invests into a company, and the investor being a PE or a VC fund, they generally insist for certain special rights to be given to them in the form of right to appoint nominee directors on the board, quorum rights with respect to shareholder meetings or director meetings, special affirmative rights or veto rights, or a right to exit by way of an IPO. So essentially, there are certain special rights that they are given. So as part of the IPO, it is expected that there are no special rights that are being given to any of the shareholders, and all shareholders should be treated on par. In this process, the articles of association of the company is also required to be amended, and any agreement that gives those special rights to the investors generally fall away. Now, say a scenario where those rights have to be fallen away, and a termination agreement has to be executed, and subsequently, because of the bad timing of the IPO fails, then in those cases, the investors generally end up being in a state where they don't have those special protections that they had as an investor, and all they would have to then settle with is the shareholder protection, which is generally available under the Indian regulations. Now, to ensure that a situation like that does not arise, what can be agreed upon in the investment agreements initially is that this termination clause, when agreed upon, should be agreed in a manner that these special rights will automatically fall away upon successful happening of an IPO. So while I'm agreeing to terminate these agreement that gave me special rights, I would rather prefer that to happen automatically than for me to agree upon it and then face a consequence where the IPO may not happen. So that is one safeguard that the investors can prefer to agree upon at the time of initial investment.
Yeah. Now, thank you. Sorry. Go ahead. I thought you were.
I think one additional point which is relevant from an investor perspective is sharing of expenses. So if you are participating in an IPO which is being done by way of an offer for sale, you would also have to bear the expenses of that in proportion of your participation in that IPO. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Prashant. We are getting a lot of questions on our chat window. Thank you for that. A lot of topics like buyback and strategic sale we are covering during the course. We will take up your questions wherever it is possible during our discussion itself, and where we can't, we will take it up at the end. With this, let me go to Supratim. Most of the exits we have seen is in terms of strategic sales. That's is becoming more popular rather than IPOs. What are the typical considerations you see in managing strategic sale, Supratim?
So essentially, a strategic sale, what it's really characterized by are essentially two features. One is that the incoming acquirer or the investor that you have has a very different mantra of investment as far as from the incumbent PE or VC investors who are already shareholders of the company. The strategic investor could be looking for anything from a meaningful strategic investment to create larger synergies for their business, or a long-term strategy as far as the larger business role of that strategic investor is concerned, as far as the market in India is concerned. So it's not necessarily linked to the financial return that financial investors look for. Secondly, and this is what really distinguishes a strategic investor from PE or VC investors, is essentially there is an aspect of there being an acquisition of control of the target. And barring situations where for commercial reasons or purely legal reasons, the acquirer cannot take up full control of the target, a strategic sale is usually marked by a control deal. Now, given that a strategic sale is usually a situation where you see most or all of the shareholders selling to a third party, it really makes the drafting of the strategic sale clause very important. And the various considerations can be boiled down into 3 or 4 points. Essentially, who gets the right to choose the buyer and trigger the sale? How is the pricing fixed given the fact that there are several stakeholders who play a part in the process? And also, who finally gets to say in the decision-making process? Now, as far as choosing the buyer is concerned, now something we need to understand is beyond just the legal drafting, in managing a strategic sale, it's also a situation where you will need to balance interests. Right. So you have a management who will be looking at continuity in their role, or at least clarity on the medium term or long term future they have with the company. You also have investors who are looking at high returns on investment. Given this, in negotiating and drafting the strategic investment clause, what is really important is to build in the decision making or the facilitating process. Once you have an investor who triggers the strategic sale and asks the management to facilitate the exit, then what is the role of the management? A popular go-to is, of course, appoint an investment banker. The investment banker will usually be appointed by the board, because the board is responsible for taking care of the rights of both the company as well as your shareholders. And investors also usually ask for an affirmative right over the appointment of the investment banking firm, as well as the terms of reference of the mandates that the investment banking firm will be providing. Then moving on, in arriving at the price at which the strategic sale is to be completed, given the fact that in a strategic sale, there is also a concept or an aspect of a control premium that the shareholders are looking to make. It is imperative that you have all your investors on board when you arrive at the fair market value or the purchase price you're looking to sell the company at. And this is important because especially for medium stage or late stage companies, where you have multiple investors sitting who have come in at different points of time, who have different investment return horizons that they're looking at. In those situations, pricing becomes really relevant, and you need to have both the management as well as your investors on board in order to ensure that the strategic exit that you're providing to everyone is value accretive. Then the next point really is on how the decision-making process is shareholders, because here you need to have a situation where all your shareholders are on board, because in the situation that there is a holdout, that might potentially be fatal to the deal. And in a situation where you have a binary between a founder-promoter, or a lead investor or an anchor investor, the situation might suddenly be straightforward, because decision making is usually much more simpler. What is more complex is where you have a situation where you have multiple stakeholders on board, and that is where lawyers as well as deal teams might want to think through a situation where you have or you can prevent holdouts from derailing a deal. And here certain things that we've seen in our transactions is essentially where you have innovative voting structures in cases of exit, where a majority of investors, if they say yes to a deal, that should go through. It doesn't matter if smaller investors say no. So, and of course, then there's also the concept of a drag right, which larger investors will have on smaller investors, and these play out in the multiple ways depending on the deal construct. Now, another thing that we've seen in strategic sales is essentially that it's usually an all-cash deal where investors are given a cash consideration. However, in the recent past and with more sophisticated parties really coming into the strategic picture, we've also seen situations where there's an equity swap, where investors swap into the stock of a listed acquirer company. That really gives them the benefit of enjoying market-linked upside following the acquisition. There are also situations where you have a merger subsidiary set up for the purposes of the acquisition. However, there are other tax-related complications, and that honestly is something that we can also pick up in a separate session on how these non-cash deals are really structured. Also, as I said, one important aspect here is, of course, the role of the manager, of the management, because unless you really provide an outlook as to where the management will stand following the completion of the deal, there is a potential for the deal not being as smooth as you would want it to be, or potentially being derailed, simply because of the fact that your management is essentially going to be fronting several commercial discussions with your strategic acquirer. They'll also be running the due diligence process. Given the fact that, and once the deal takes place, the transition work will also be done through the management. Given the fact that management is a cornerstone in any of these deals, you will have to have the management on board as well. And as far as the management or the founders is concerned, where of course the company is driven by a group of founders or a personality-driven management you have, there one important thing that we want to scratch out early in the process, or at least at the correct time, is what the role of the founder will be going forward, or the role of the management will be going forward. If negotiations have to happen on severance packages, that also needs to be done at the correct stage, so that there is no sort of confusion at a later stage. And these are commercial points really, but however, these do play a very important aspect as far as deal is concerned. The other thing that we usually see, and this is a key negotiation point in any of these sort of deals, is where you have essentially who is going to stand behind the reps warranties that the company, that the investor or the strategic acquirer will want to take. Typically, private equity or VC investors will stand behind these warranties because they're not part of the day-to-day management. What we've seen is that the company, or in certain cases, company and founder usually stand behind the reps warranties, and they need to back them up with indemnity. The limited role that private equity investors really play as far as the reps and warranties are concerned is that they give you what you call fundamental warranties around title to security or their authority and capacity to enter into a contract. But that is the limited role. Then, of course, I mean, we've seen situations where rests and warranties, insurance contracts or products are becoming more and more popular in this space. However, that's a separate discussion altogether. I thought, back to you.
Thank you. What we saw was strategic sale becomes a lot more complicated when there are multiple investors there, and I think that's true for a lot of other rights. So we will also address some of those in the time what we have left. Right, Parag, let me come to you. One of the key aspects of investors' exit rights is free transferability, which means that they should have as less restriction as they can when they want to transfer the shares to anyone. So what do you think are some of the restrictions which you see in free transferability, and can you just tell us some aspect of that, Parag?
So as correctly mentioned, that most of the investors would want a free transferability of their shares, and in my view, I think that's one of the key rights that they want, because irrespective of what the exit waterfall is, if they get a good price at some point of time, they should be able to sell their shares and exit, notwithstanding the whole time period for exit that is otherwise set out in the documents, right? So while typically most of the agreements, you will see that there is a free transferability for the investors at any point of time. However, there are certain restrictions that are imposed from a company perspective and vis-a-vis the other investors. So I'll get into the restriction that typically a company would want against the investor. But before that, in limited cases, as you mentioned, that where there are multiple investors, right, the other investors may not want a particular investor to just go and sell the shares to someone else. So typically they would want to have a right of first offer, in that case. So wherever an investor is selling the shares to someone, they should first come and offer it to the other investor or a lead investor, depending on the dynamics of the investors, right? But this is not a very, very standard clause. You may find it in later stage deals, but early stage deals, it's still not there. But the most important restriction from a company perspective, that is included in the investment agreement is restriction on transfer to a competitor, right? Because obviously a company would not want a competitor to be sitting on its cap table, where they have access to certain kind of confidential information, etc., as part of standard disclosures. So that is something that company always asks or in the investment document. Now, the key question here that comes is, who is a competitor, right? Broadly speaking, is anyone who is involved in a business which is similar to the business of the company, and accordingly, company would not want the investor to sell the shares to that person. However, keeping it at such a broad level does not work from an investor perspective all the time, because in order to then, before they are selling to a third party, they would have to do that whole determination of whether that person is involved in a business which is similar to business of the company. So typically how investors want to project, who a competitor is, they would ask the company to identify a specific set of persons or entities who they believe are their competitors as on date. That list is included in the investment document, so that investor knows very clearly that to which entity it is prohibited from selling the shares to. However, then another practical problem is, today someone may be a competitor, tomorrow that person may not exist, or companies do change their businesses, right? So in that case, the company typically retains the ability to update that list within at set intervals. It may be biannually or annually, and typically, because they want to avoid negotiations at a later stage with the investor, this responsibility is left to the board to decide who a competitor, which is a mix of both promoters and investors, with investors having a particular say in that, in deciding who the competitor is at a future stage. While as I mentioned, that investors would want to have a limited set, we have seen in cases where there is a broad definition included, that any person who is involved in the business of the company or similar to the business of the company also gets included. But then again, there it is subject to, certain thresholds that should be put, because there are times when a company may have multiple types of businesses, right? One competitor may be involved in multiple businesses, and a company may believe that, that person is my competitor, right? So what typically we say is that in that case, if there are multiple businesses, then that person should derive a substantial portion of its revenue, can be pegged at 30%, 50%, 60, 70, depending on what the business of the company is and how many other companies are involved in similar businesses, to decide on who's a competitor from that definition perspective. Then, you would also not want to restrict the definition to, from a company's perspective, to a particular entity, because there are structures used where a particular group may be using a particular company, a specific SPV, for this purpose. So you would also want to extend the restriction to anyone controlling that particular entity. Though financial investors, because they are not typically deemed to be in control, and have only economic interest, they get excluded from that definition. However, this restriction is not always maintained in the life cycle of the investment. So there are certain limited situations. For example, as you mentioned, the waterfall that is there in an exit. So if the company is not able to provide an exit to the investors, and finally investors take control of the process and enforce a drag right where they control the exit process, in that situations, they should be able to sell to a competitor, because company has failed to give an exit, and obviously a competitor is one of the most suited person to buy the company. Another situation where we have seen that this right typically falls away if there is an event of default, which is a serious breach by the company of its obligations, or some level of fraud happening at the company level or by the promoter, where investors don't want to continue in the company. They would want to have a right to sell to the competitor, because that's the easiest buyer for fraud from their perspective. Briefly, I will also touch upon another situation that we have seen where there's a restriction on transfer by the investors, is which happens in certain cases where a particular set of investors, or an investor who's more of a strategic slash or corporate VC, who's on the cap table. Such investors would not want any investor to sell their shares to their competitors, right? So which that entity may not be a competitor of the company, but it's a competitor of one of the investors. And if they have invested in this company, they would not want their competitor to come into this company, because they may have future plans with respect to the company, going for a full acquisition at some point of time, etc. So in that case, they want to limit the sale to a competitor, their own competitor, not necessarily a competitor of the company. What do you, Babu?
Thank you. We also discussed buyback as one of the exit options. Parag, why don't you tell a little bit more about the buyback rights and what are the issues which we face when under regulation and law from buyback perspective? And also, I think Ishan Chopra has asked a question on buyback. Can you address that question also during your discussion?
From a buyback perspective, now, what is a buyback? Just to explain, in simple terms, is a situation where the company purchases the shares, its own shares, from the shareholders. While buyback is included as a contractual right in the investment agreement, the law, our Companies Act, has a detailed process on how a buyback can be effected, in case the company wants to go for it. So while we do put it in our investment agreement, it is subject to, it's bound to follow the process that is set out in the Companies Act. And through contract, we cannot override that process. So at all points of time, while giving effect to a buyback, the company is required to follow the buyback process. In certain cases where there are multiple investors, because buyback entails outflow of cash from the company, right? And there are legal restrictions which I will just briefly touch upon. There is also a buyback slash something in common parlance that we call a put right, is again and can be enforced against the promoter. So instead, the investor requiring the company to buy its shares, it can ask the promoter to buy its shares, because in that case it's between that investor and the promoter, and company is not necessarily involved or affected in any manner. And from a put option perspective, the Companies Act at least does not set out any process other than the usual transfer process. But buyback as a right has its own limitations while giving effect to it. So one is in terms of the Companies Act, because Companies Act sets out various thresholds for it, or process to be followed. One is in terms of source of funds from where the buyback can be funded by the company, right? Then certain kinds of approvals are required at both at the board and the shareholder level. Then there are limitations on how much money the company can expend while giving effect to the buyback, which is 25% of its paid up capital and free reserves as per its latest audited balance sheet. And how many shares company can buy back in one go, right? So there are inherent limitations. So especially when there are multiple investors involved, it may not be possible for the company to give exit to all the investors to buyback through buyback. Another issue that a very important issue from as you when you started discussion, you said we'll assume that the investor is a non-resident investor and the company is Indian, is imposed under FEMA, which says which basically imposes a restriction on any kind of assured return to be provided to a non-resident investor. So in that case, because investors, when they're investing, have a certain threshold in mind, there, because of the assured return issue, the investor may not be able to exit at the desired price that they want. So what the company has to do, it has to give effect to the buyback at the fair market value, which is determined using any of the internationally recognized methodologies. So from that perspective, it does not, it's while it's included in the agreements, it's not a very practical exit. Another situation that we have seen recently is after the Indian accounting standards have been some companies are required to follow it. What Indian accounting standards say is that if there is an obligation on the company to effect a buyback without some sort of best efforts, right, or a fall away threshold, then it becomes a liability in the books of the company. And till that right continues, till the exit continues, that liability will be reflected in the books of the company. So we have seen cases where upon company's request and discussion with the investors, that right has been dropped. Yeah. And with respect to briefly from a put option perspective, frankly, in VC deals we can include it, but with multiple investors putting millions of dollars, a founder typically will not have the wherewithal or the capacity to buy everyone out. So again, it's good to have. You should not expect much from that, right?
Thank you, Parag. Supratim, let me come to you. We are running short of time, so can you just spend a few minutes discussing this? What my question to you is, there have been a lot of discussion saying that exits are difficult, in India, especially by the foreign investors. Can you elaborate on the issues which they face? And this also, can you address also Niyati's question? Her question is between domestic investor and foreign investor. What are the specific exit consideration, right, which are relevant? So if you can just address that in your discussion, that will be great. But just spend a few minutes on this.
Capital, as far as exits in India are concerned, see, what we have to appreciate is India is still a young market as far as PE and VC investments are concerned, or even let's say foreign investment into Indian companies. It's still a new concept, and Indian markets are not as mature and robust as, let's say, your Western markets. Both your investors, your deal team, advisors, everyone is picking up concepts. There's always new learning that's happening. So having said that, there are things that Indian deals and especially transactions where exits are concerned, there are things that that we still need to perhaps work on as a market as a whole. Having said that, what we've seen is that there are distinct Indian flavors that are there in every deal. And this primarily comes from the fact that India has a very different and nuanced regulatory framework as far as regulating foreign investments are concerned. And this perhaps also addresses Niyati's question in that, see, as far as foreign investments are concerned, they are regulated under, amongst other things, under the Foreign Exchange Management Act. Now, as far as FEMA is concerned, and any investment where or a transaction where there is a transfer of a security between a resident investor and a non-resident investor, there are pricing guidelines that you need to adhere to. Where a non-resident investor and a resident investor are concerned, the transfer of the security can never be at a price where the purchase consideration exceeds the fair market value. So it is capped at that limit. Now, given this scenario, you will have to ensure that your FMV and the price at which you are doing the transaction is exactly the fair market value. Otherwise, it is violative of FEMA. This of course goes back to my earlier point on how complex and how crucial it is that you have every investor and stakeholder on board as well, because if you have shareholders who are partly domestic and partly foreign based, you will have to grapple with this situation where pricing guidelines will need to be adhered to. You can't really have a premium over the FMV. The other key aspect that we've seen in strategic sales or where exits are concerned is a situation where if you're approached by a strategic acquirer or a third-party acquirer where a key deal consideration is a deferred consideration, like for instance in the nature of an earnout, where you have a portion of the purchase price that's kept aside for future linked events like a performance-based payment at a later stage, that is permissible under FEMA. However, you can only defer up to 25% of the consideration. Also, where you have a structured deal which is in the nature of a cash-free debt deal, which is essentially your the enterprise value that you ascribe to the purchase consideration does not take into account any cash or debt balances that you will have at the time of closing. That will also need to be adjusted for in both from a documentation perspective, as well as you'll also need to see how it's treated under FEMA. Now, as far as FEMA is concerned, the period of deferment is also limited to 18 months from the date on which the investment agreement was entered into. So if you have a long period between signing and closing of a transaction, the effective period for which you can defer is much lesser. That is something that is a key consideration we always have to factor in whenever we discuss deferred consideration. Also, one other aspect that is particularly challenging in these transactions is reporting under FEMA, because not only do you need to have your authorized dealer bank on board with the manner in which the payments will be made, because they are your primary contact as far as FEMA compliances are concerned. Reporting it is also fairly challenging because if you are aware, when you file a Form SPTRS, for instance, you will have to disclose 100% of the consideration upfront. When you do that, you will have to ensure that whatever adjustments you make at a later stage, whether for purchase price or for earnout-based payments, that will all need to be within that 25% number. And that is something that you can either document through perhaps thresholds that you will build into your investment documents, or you have your accounts teams or your finance teams work closely to ensure that balances at closing do not affect the proportion between the upfront consideration as well as the deferred portion. And the other key aspect that governs investments, again, is your sectoral restrictions, and this applies to, in certain cases, to both domestic investors as well as foreign investors, because you have regulated sectors, particularly, let's say, your financial services sector, where you have regulators such as the IRDA or the RBI who are keen to understand who the incoming investor is. There is a detailed scrutiny process that happens before the closing. And if you have a foreign acquirer, so you add to that, in addition to the scrutiny process as well as the requirement in the cases of insurance perhaps, or banking services, or aviation for that matter, the requirement to ensure that there is substantial Indian ownership and control in these transactions. And that is where a form of a strategic sale might also take place, where you have post the acquisition by the strategic acquirer, a joint venture scenario where you will again need to negotiate rights with the promoters of the company. The other unfortunate aspect that we've seen in these transactions is, of course, frequent policy changes, which have affected deal contours, where you have perhaps in the situation of, let's say, e-commerce, which is an infamous example, where within a short period of time, the government changed the entire business model that was permissible under FEMA into what we call the marketplace model from the inventory-based model. Or you again have perhaps a circular that came out the press note that came out last Saturday, which restricts investments from a particular country or neighboring countries of India. And that has created a fair bit of confusion in ongoing transactions that we have. And that's something that is perhaps a reality of transactions in India. And you continue to deal with it and see how it evolves. Over to you, Gaurav.
Thank you. Thank you, Supratim. We are running out of time. There are a few other rights which are there, including tag rights, drag rights, liquidation preference, which we are going to take tomorrow. We have a special session on enforcing liquidation preference. We will also take a drag and tag rights. With this, let me come back now to the questions. I'll address some of the questions which have been asked. We tried to address many of them during our discussion, but I will pick some of them which have recently come in. I think Pratik is asking what typically is the type of equity issued to investor in PE investments in India. Is it convertible preferred stock? The answer is yes. It's what you call compulsory convertible preference shares. Is most common most common instrument used, especially because if a foreign investor is coming in, then you can either issue him an equity or a compulsory convertible instrument, and typically that would be compulsory convertible preference shares. In some situation, we see compulsory convertible debentures, but mostly it is compulsory convertible preference shares. Some of the late stage companies, or sometimes in certain situations, we have seen equity being issued, but that's something which is not very common. So with this, I think there's another related question. What is more preferable, CCPS or CCDs? I think CCPS is more popular more than CCDs. For primary reason is because CCPS goes into the shares, and CCDs typically goes into the debt. And having more debt in the company's books are not something which is good from several perspectives, and we'll not get into that right now. But CCPS is most popular. Parag, let me ask you a question. I think Dinesh has asked this question on strategic sale, specifically on reps and warranties, which buyer wants. How are that addressed, Parag? Can you take that up?
Sure, Raghav. So, right, Dinesh, I think you have correctly mentioned that, it's very tough to actually, envisage what will happen at the time of the exit, and, what are the types of reps, warranties, indemnities that will be asked by the buyer. Further, it's also a function of who the buyer is at that point of time. So, in order to how typically it's addressed in the investment documents, while we are drafting it and entering into the agreements, is what investors say is typically that they will not be providing any reps and warranties with respect to the sale, except to the extent of title to their shares and their authority capacity to sell, right? Now the question comes, there is a whole bunch of operational and business warranties, right? Who will give it, right? So while investors, we have seen in cases push for saying that the founder will give the business and operational warranties and corresponding indemnities, they have also realized that, from a practical perspective, it becomes very tough for a founder to, back the entire set of operational warranties at the time of exit. So, typically, what the document says is they will just speak about what the investors will give and not really get into what will happen later. But if you ask us, when we do actually those exits, typically what has started happening is, you will end up taking a reps and warranties insurance. So because investors, while they won't give the reps will be given by the company, but because they are getting money and not the entire cash is going to the founder, there'll be a reps and warranties insurance that will be taken for each of those reps. And depending on the buy side, sell side, it's commercially agreed who will pay the premium for that.
Thank you, Parag. There were a couple of questions on drag rights, which we will address it tomorrow in our tomorrow session. There were a couple of questions on pandemic situation like what we are facing right now. In that situation, what happens from valuation perspective? What happens from exit rights perspective? I think we had a special session on force majeure clause earlier in the earlier couple of weeks ago. You may want to just visit that. So we have addressed those questions in that recording. There is another question from Akshay, who says that does non-resident investor definition includes Indian subsidiaries? The answer is yes. Typically, if a 100% owner or Indian subsidiaries owned majority by a foreign investor, then a lot of restrictions which are applicable to a foreign investor also applicable to Indian subsidiaries. So you need to be careful on what you do there. There are many other questions, but I'm sorry we are running out of time. So I will pass mic to DN, and before I do, I want to thank each one of you for participating and asking a lot of questions. I know we have not been able to answer all the questions. There were too many of them. If you want us to take offline, please send us a question and we'll try to see if we can answer them.